What happens when everything you believe is a lie? When the monsters you've been taught to fear are the only ones who can save you? For a young woman orphaned by violence, the line between enemy and savior blurs under the vast, unforgiving sky of the Arizona Territory. She thought she was clever pretending to be asleep to learn the plans of her Apache captors. But what she overheard in their hushed, guttural whispers wasn't a plan for her death. It was a plan that would unravel her soul, challenge every ounce of her hatred, and force her to confront a truth far more terrifying than any blade. Stay with me as we journey into the heart of the Wild West, into a story of survival, betrayal, and a love that was never supposed to happen. The fire was a miser, hoarding its warmth. It spat embers into the cavernous dark of the Arizona night, each spark a fleeting star against the oppressive black of the Dragoon Mountains. Olivia Rose lay on the hard-packed earth, her cheek pressed into the grit and dust. The rough weave of the blanket thrown over her did little to ward off the bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of absolute paralyzing fear. She kept her breathing even a slow and steady rhythm she had perfected over the last 2 years. It was the breathing of sleep, of harmlessness. A predator she'd learned rarely wasted its energy on prey that was already dead to the world. And these men, the 3 Apache warriors who sat silhouetted against the meager flames, were predators of the highest order. Her world had been forged in fire and blood. She was only 16, but she had the eyes of someone who had seen the end of the world and had been forced to keep living. The Comanches had seen to that, sweeping down on their small homestead near the Pecos River 2 years ago. They had taken everything: her mother's laughter, her father's strength, the very concept of safety. They had left her alive, a trembling ghost in the ashes of her own life. That was where Adrian Croft had found her, a greasy, opportunistic trader with a heart as barren as the alkali flats he traversed. Croft had taken her in. Not out of kindness, but for the utility of an extra pair of hands that required no pay, only scraps, and the occasional backhanded reminder of her place. For 2 years she had been his shadow, his drudge, his property. It was from Croft's caravan that the Apache had taken her just this afternoon, in a whirlwind of dust and confusion that was terrifyingly familiar. Now she lay perfectly still, a prisoner once more. Her hatred for the savages was a hard, polished stone in her gut. Comanche Apache, they were one and the same to her, the architects of her ruin. So she feigned sleep, a desperate gambit to glean some insight into their intentions. Her ears strained, filtering out the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of a distant coyote, focusing on the low, guttural sounds of their conversation. There were 3 of them. The one who seemed to be the leader was broad-shouldered and sat with an unnerving stillness, his long black hair framing a face carved from granite. He hadn't spoken much since her capture. His name, she'd heard the others say, was Nachokai. The second, younger and leaner, was more agitated. He paced the edge of the firelight, his movements jerky and filled with a nervous energy. Tarza. The third was older, his face a road map of wrinkles, and he was tending to a small pouch with a quiet reverence. Olivia's mind raced, painting gruesome pictures of her fate. She had heard the stories from settlers, from Croft himself, tales of torture and slow, agonizing deaths reserved for white captives. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, to bolt into the darkness, but she knew it was suicide. The mountains belonged to them. Here she was, the intruder, as helpless as a field mouse under the shadow of a hawk. She focused on their voices, trying to decipher the cadence, the intent. Tarza spoke first, his voice a harsh rasp. He gestured towards her with a flick of his chin. The words were in their native tongue, a river of sound she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was dismissive, angry. He was arguing. Nacho Kai responded, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep in the earth. It was calm, measured, but held an undeniable authority that made Taza fall silent. The older warrior murmured something, his gaze fixed on the leader. This was it. They were deciding her fate. Olivia held her breath, the stone of hatred in her stomach turning to ice. She braced herself for the words she knew must be coming, words about pain, about ending her life, about making an example of her. She thought of her father, Jedediah Rose, and how he'd stood his ground until the very end. She would have to be strong like him. She would not give them the satisfaction of her screams. Taza spoke again, louder this time, stabbing a finger in her direction. Even without understanding the language, a few words, warped by their pronunciation, snagged in her memory. Words she had heard from Mexican traders in Croft's company. Mexicano. Medicina. What did Mexicans have to do with this, or medicine? Her mind, already stretched, taut with fear, struggled to connect the pieces. It made no sense. Why would they be talking about medicine when they had a captive to deal with? Then Nacho Kai spoke again, and this time his voice was different. It was laced with a weariness so profound it seemed to seep into the very air around the fire. He spoke for a long time, his words flowing not with the fire of a warrior, but with the heavy weight of a leader carrying his people on his shoulders. And in the middle of his speech, Olivia heard it. A single, chillingly familiar phrase, spoken in broken, heavily accented English. It was not meant for her. It was an explanation, a point of emphasis for the others. The words dropped into the silent night, and into Olivia's soul like stones into a deep, dark well. Trade her for the cure. Olivia's world stopped. Cure. Trade her. The ice in her gut shattered, replaced by a disbelieving cold dread that was somehow worse than the fear of death. They weren't talking about torturing her. They weren't planning to kill her for sport or revenge. She lay rigid, her carefully constructed mask of sleep threatening to crack. Her mind reeled, trying to process the implications. Her entire survival strategy, built on the assumption of their monstrous, bloodthirsty nature, was a lie. Their plan wasn't born of hatred for her, but of a desperate need she couldn't comprehend. She risked the slightest flutter of her eyelids, peering through the thicket of her lashes. She saw Nacho Kai's face, illuminated by the fire. The stoic mask was gone. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability. The look in his eyes wasn't that of a savage killer. It was the look of a man watching his world die. Olivia Rose, who had prided herself on her resilience, on her unshakable hatred, felt something she hadn't felt since the day her family was slaughtered, utter, gut-wrenching confusion. She had prepared for a fight against monsters. She had no idea how to survive men. She froze, not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that the simple black and white world she had built from her pain had just been obliterated. The plan she had overheard was not about her death. It was about their life, and somehow that was infinitely more terrifying. The silence that followed Nacho Kai's English words was heavier than any sound. Olivia lay entombed within it, her mind a frantic scramble. Trade her for the cure. The phrase echoed, dismantling the fortress of hatred she had so carefully constructed. Monsters killed for pleasure, for sport, for the sheer darkness in their hearts. Men, however, men killed for reasons. They traded, they bartered, they sacrificed one life to save many. And that logic, that cold, desperate calculus, was a language she understood far too well. She continued her ruse, forcing her body to remain limp, her breathing deep and even. but behind her closed eyes, her world was tilting on its axis. She strained to listen again, as Taza replied, his tone still sharp, but now tinged with something else, not outrage, but a grudging pragmatism. The conversation continued in their Chiricahua dialect, but Olivia was no longer just hearing noise. She was listening for context, for the emotional currents beneath the words. She could piece together the horrifying tapestry of their desperation. They weren't a war party. They were on a mission. The word Medicina was repeated along with Sonora. They were heading south into Mexico. The older warrior, whose name she now gathered, was Geronimo, a name that sent a shiver of a different kind of fear down her spine, a name whispered with dread at every trading post. And Army Fort held up the small leather pouch. He spoke with a gravelly reverence, and Olivia caught the glint of something in the firelight as he opened it. Silver. Not coins, but raw, heavy nuggets. This was their currency, stolen no doubt, but meant for a purpose beyond simple greed. Her preconceived notions began to crumble like sun-baked clay. She had envisioned them as a roving band of killers taking her as a prize. The reality was so much more complex, so much more human. These men were on a desperate flight to save their people from a plague she couldn't imagine. A sickness, a cure. And she, Olivia Rose, was an unexpected complication, a piece of leverage they hadn't sought, but were now forced to play. Taza's argument, she now understood, hadn't been about the morality of killing her. It had been about efficiency. He saw her as a liability, another mouth to feed a slowing of their pace, a risk of discovery. His sharp gestures pointed back the way they came, then south. He was arguing to leave her, to abandon her to the wilderness. It wasn't mercy. It was cold, hard logic. A dead weight cut loose. It was Nacho Kai who had refused. His low, rumbling dissent was not about her value as a trade commodity, but something else. He was the one who had pulled her from the path of Croft's wagon wheel. He was the one who had cut her bonds, replacing the rough rope with softer leather ties that chafed less. He had looked at her not as an object, but as a being. A nuisance, perhaps, but a living one. Olivia's heart pounded against her ribs. Who was the bigger monster? Taza, who would leave her to die of thirst or be taken by wolves, or Adrian Croft, who had kept her alive in a cage of servitude, his casual cruelty a daily poison. The lines were blurring, the colors of good and evil, bleeding into an indistinguishable gray. The conversation eventually died down. Geronimo carefully repacked the silver. Taza took the first watch, stalking to the edge of the camp, and melting into the shadows, his discontent, a palpable presence. Nacho Kai remained by the fire, staring into the flames. He picked up a stick and began to draw in the dirt. Olivia, risking another glance, saw him sketch a series of lines and circles. A map. He was tracing their path, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not a mindless savage. He was a strategist, a leader burdened with impossible choices. He carried the fate of his people in the tense line of his shoulders. For the first time in 2 years, Olivia felt a flicker of something other than hatred for the people who had captured her. It wasn't sympathy, not yet. It was a terrifying spark of understanding. She understood desperation. She understood doing whatever it took to survive. She had lived that reality every day under Croft's thumb. The revelation left her feeling naked and exposed. Her hate had been a shield, a thick armor that protected the wounded girl inside. It made the world simple. There were victims, her, and there were monsters, them. But if they were not monsters, then what were they? And more importantly, what did that make her? Was she just a pawn in their desperate game? An unfortunate casualty in a war. she had no part in. The thought was infuriating. Her life, her future was being decided by men who saw her as a means to an end, a sack of flour to be traded for something more valuable. The bitter irony was not lost on her. It was no different from her life with Adrian Croft. She had merely exchanged one master for another. The fire burned low, and the chill of the high desert night deepened. Nachokai eventually lay down, wrapping himself in a single thin blanket not far from her. The camp fell into a true silence, broken only by the wind whispering through the scrub brush. Olivia lay awake long into the night, the pretense of sleep now a genuine impossibility. The plan she had overheard had not brought her the certainty of a quick death, but the uncertainty of a life bartered and sold. They were taking her to Sonora to trade her to the Mexicans for medicine. Her fate was not to be a victim of Apache cruelty, but a piece of merchandise in a transaction of survival. She didn't know whether to be relieved or more terrified than ever. She had frozen when she heard their plan, and in that frozen state, a new resolve began to crystallize. She was not a sack of flour. She was not a bargaining chip. She was Olivia Rose, daughter of Jedediah Rose, and she was a survivor. They may have a plan for her, but she would have a plan of her own. She would watch, she would learn, and when the moment was right, she would run. She would not be traded. She would not be sold. She would be free. But as she plotted her escape, a sliver of doubt entered her mind. She was plotting against men who were trying to save their families, and that thought, more than anything else, was the most dangerous poison of all. When the first hint of dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of bruised purple and grey, Olivia decided it was time to wake. She stirred, making a small pained sound, and slowly pushed herself up. The effect was immediate. Taza, who now sat by the fire, was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. His eyes were narrow slits of suspicion. Nachokai rose more slowly, his movements fluid and economical. He watched her, his expression unreadable, but his gaze lacked the overt hostility of his companion. He simply observed as a man might watch a newly broken horse to see if it would bolt. Olivia kept her eyes downcast, feigning a terror she no longer fully felt. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath her skin, but it was now overlaid with a cold, calculating awareness. She huddled in her blanket, making herself appear as small and non-threatening as possible. She was no longer just a captive. She was an actress on a hostile stage, and her life depended on her performance. Nachokai approached and offered her a piece of dried meat and a water skin. His hand was steady, his gesture simple. It was not an act of kindness, she told herself, but one of practicality. They needed their merchandise alive and reasonably healthy. Still, when her fingers brushed his as she took the offered sustenance, she felt a jolt. His skin was warm, calloused, the hand of a man who worked and fought. It was just a hand, yet it felt unnervingly human. She ate the tough, smoky jerky, slowly, her eyes scanning her surroundings in the growing light. They were camped in a rocky alcove, well hidden from any passing patrol or traveler. The landscape was brutal and magnificent, a panorama of ochre rock, thorny scrub, and distant hazy mazes. It was a land that did not suffer fools or the weak. She understood now why these people were as hard as the country that bred them. The journey began soon after. They did not speak to her, nor did they treat her with overt cruelty. Taza prodded her forward with a sharp word when she stumbled, but Nachokai, leading the way, set a pace that was grueling, but not impossible. He moved through the treacherous terrain with a grace that was mesmerizing his moccasins, making almost no sound on the rocky ground. He seemed a part of the land itself, his senses attuned to every shift in the wind, every disturbed pebble. As they traveled, Olivia's perception began to shift in subtle, unsettling ways. She started to see things not through the lens of a terrified captive, but through the eyes of a survivor trying to learn. She watched how Nacho Kai read the landscape, finding paths that were invisible to her. She saw Geronimo identify a plant with dull green leaves crushing them and applying the pulp to a cut on Taza's arm. She saw their silent communication, a raised hand, a tilted head that conveyed more than a dozen spoken words. They were not the chaotic, whooping savages of her nightmares. They were a disciplined, efficient unit moving with a singular purpose. And their purpose, she kept reminding herself, was to sell her. One afternoon as they crossed a wide, sun-blasted arroyo, her foot slipped on a loose rock. She tumbled down a short, steep embankment, her ankle twisting painfully beneath her. A sharp cry escaped her lips before she could stifle it. Taza cursed and glared at her as if she had done it on purpose. He clearly saw her as nothing but a hindrance. But Nacho Kai was at her side in an instant. He knelt, his dark eyes scanning her for injury. Without a word, he gently took her foot in his hands. His touch was surprisingly careful, his fingers probing the swelling ankle with a practiced skill that suggested he had done this many times before. Olivia flinched, her body rigid with a lifetime of ingrained fear and mistrust. "Don't touch me!" She hissed the words raw and weak. Nacho Kai looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time, she saw something in them, beyond stoicism or calculation. It was a flicker of something. Annoyance, perhaps, but also a deep, weary patience. He ignored her protest, his grip firm but not painful. He gave a slight nod, seemingly satisfied that nothing was broken, and then looked back up the trail. He knew as she did that she couldn't walk on it. Taza began to argue, his voice sharp and insistent. He pointed at her, then to the south, then made a motion with his hands, as if casting something aside. The meaning was terrifyingly clear. "Leave her. She is slowing us down." Nacho Kai listened, his face impassive. When Taza was finished, he gave a single sharp shake of his head. He spoke one word in his own tongue, a word that carried the unmistakable weight of command. Taza fell silent, his face a mask of thunderous disapproval. Then Nacho Kai did something that shocked Olivia to her core. He turned his back to her and crouched down, gesturing over his shoulder. He intended to carry her. The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she believed that she could only stare. The thought of being in such close physical contact with him was both terrifying and confusing. It was a gesture of profound practicality, yet it felt like something more. It was a choice. He had chosen not to leave her. He had chosen to take on her burden himself. Hesitantly knowing she had no other option, she allowed him to help her onto his back. His shoulders were broad and powerful, the muscles moving smoothly beneath his deerskin shirt. As he rose and began to walk, matching the pace of the others, she was forced to wrap her arms around his neck to keep her balance. The world became a rhythm of his steady breathing and the silent pad of his moccasins on the dirt. She could feel the warmth of his body, smell the faint, clean scent of sage and sweat and leather. It was an intimacy that was deeply unsettling. This man, this savage, who was taking her to be sold, was now her lifeline, the only thing keeping her from being left to die in the wilderness. She rested her head against his back, exhausted, and in pain, her mind a whirlwind of contradictions. She had been taught that these people were monsters, driven by a lust for blood. But the monster she was clinging to had just saved her life, not out of any discernible kindness, but out of a sense of responsibility that she couldn't fathom. She was his cargo, his asset, and as he carried her through the unforgiving landscape, Olivia began to wonder who was truly the captive. Was it her, the girl, being carried to an unknown fate? Or was it him, a man so bound by duty that he would carry his enemy on his back just to save his own people? The unspoken language of his actions was far more powerful than any words, and it was telling her a story that dismantled her hatred, one painful step at a time. For 2 days, Nacho Kai carried her whenever the terrain was too rough for her to manage on her throbbing ankle. The arrangement created a silent, charged space between them. Olivia was hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. She learned the steady, powerful rhythm of his stride. She felt the tension in his shoulders when Taza would look back at them with open scorn. He never spoke to her, and she remained silent. But the physical act of reliance was a conversation in itself. It was a language of weight and support, of vulnerability and strength. During their rests, she would watch him. He was not like the brash, loud white men she knew from the trading posts. He was quiet, observant, his presence carrying a gravity that drew the eye. He would sit apart, sharpening his knife or checking the state of their dwindling supplies, his face a study in concentration. She saw the way Geronimo would confer with him, their heads close together, a clear deference in the older warrior's posture. Nacho Kai was not just a leader by strength, but by wisdom. Her ankle slowly began to heal the swelling, reducing enough for her to limp alongside them again. The independence was a relief, but she felt an odd sense of loss at the distance it created between her and Nacho Kai. She scolded herself for the thought. He was her captor. This strange intimacy was a product of circumstance, nothing more. Their path took them down from the high rocky passes into the lower desert, a landscape of saguaro cactus brittlebush and suffocating heat. The sun was a relentless hammer, and water became more precious than the silver Geronimo carried. It was on a particularly grueling afternoon, as they navigated a narrow, sun-baked canyon, that the world erupted in a blur of motion and sound. A dry, chilling rattle echoed from a ledge just beside the trail. Olivia saw it at the same moment as Nacho Kai. Coiled in the sliver of shade beneath a scrubby mesquite was a large diamondback rattlesnake, its head raised its tail, a blur of deadly warning. It was directly in her path. Instinct born of pure terror seized her. She screamed and scrambled backward, tripping over her own feet and landing hard in the dust. Taza and Geronimo froze weapons instantly in hand, but the snake agitated and cornered ignored them. Its focus was on the sudden movement on Olivia. It lunged. Time seemed to warp, stretching into an impossibly long moment. Olivia threw her arms up to shield her face, a pathetic and useless gesture. She saw the fangs, the gaping mouth, the strike coming directly for her. A dark shape slammed into her, knocking the air from her lungs. It was Nacho Kai. He had moved with an explosive speed that defied belief, throwing himself between her and the snake. He twisted his body, taking the full force of the strike on his own leather-clad forearm. He let out a sharp grunt of pain. The snake, having spent its venom, recoiled. Before it could strike again, Taza's knife flew through the air, embedding itself in the serpent's head with a sickening thud. Silence descended upon the canyon, thick and heavy. Olivia lay on the ground, gasping for breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nacho Kai stood over her, his left arm held stiffly at his side. He looked down at his forearm where 2 tiny dark punctures were already beginning to swell and discolor on the tanned skin just above his leather bracer. He had just saved her life. Not as a matter of practicality, not to protect his merchandise. He had taken the venom meant for her. It was a purely instinctual act of protection, a sacrifice made in a split second. Geronimo rushed to his side, his face etched with alarm. He immediately began working barking orders at Taza. They pulled a wicked-looking knife from Nacho Kai's sheath. Olivia watched in horror as Geronimo, without hesitation, made 2 deep slashes over the bite marks, creating a crude X. Dark blood welled up instantly. Geronimo put his mouth to the wound, sucking forcefully and spitting the poisoned blood onto the dusty ground. Taza, meanwhile, turned on Olivia. His face was contorted with a furious rage that was far more terrifying than his earlier scorn. He stormed over to her, grabbing her by the front of her worn shirt and hauling her to her feet. "Diyin," he snarled, the word spat like a curse. He shook her violently. "This is your fault. You are a curse. We should have left you for the coyotes." His grip was like iron, his dark eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and fear. He truly believed she was bad medicine, a harbinger of doom that had now struck down their leader. He raised his free hand, and for a terrifying second, Olivia was certain he was going to strike her or worse. Taza. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense air like a razor. It was Nacho Kai. He was pale, sweating, leaning heavily on Geronimo, but his eyes were fixed on his friend, and they held an unyielding command. "Hagola, leave her." Taza froze his knuckles white where he gripped her shirt. He was visibly torn between his rage and his loyalty. He stared at Nacho Kai, then back at Olivia, his lip curling in a snarl of disgust. With a final violent shove, he released her, sending her stumbling backward. "She is not worth your life," Taza said in his own language, his voice thick with emotion. Nacho Kai's response was quiet, but firm. A life is a life. Geronimo worked feverishly, packing the bleeding wound with a poultice of crushed herbs he produced from his medicine bag. Nacho Kai's breathing was becoming labored, a sheen of cold sweat covering his forehead. The venom was moving through him, a potent and fast-acting poison. Olivia stood apart, trembling and useless. The man who had captured her, the man she was supposed to hate, had just put himself at death's door for her. And in doing so, he had earned the burning wrath of his closest friend. She was no longer just a pawn in their plan. She had become the focal point of a conflict between them, a wedge driven into the heart of their small, desperate band. The trust she had seen between them was now fractured, replaced by Taza's simmering resentment. He looked at her, as if she were the serpent itself. And as she watched Nacho Kai fight for his life against the poison, Olivia felt a devastating wave of guilt wash over her. It was a foreign, unwelcome emotion. For 2 years, her world had been about her own survival, her own pain. Now, for the first time, she was consumed with a desperate, agonizing fear for someone else, for her enemy, for her savior. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare. Nacho Kai's strong frame was racked with fever and chills. Geronimo never left his side, forcing a dark, bitter-smelling liquid down his throat and changing the poultice on his arm, which had swollen to a grotesque size and turned a deep, angry purple. Taza's hostility towards Olivia solidified into a wall of silent, menacing contempt. He refused to look at her, refused to acknowledge her presence, except as a source of blame. His vigil was for his leader, and in his eyes, she was the assassin. Olivia felt like a ghost, useless. The guilt gnawed at her, a physical ache in her chest. This was her fault, her scream, her clumsiness. She replayed the moment of the snake's strike over and over, Nacho Kai's body shielding hers. A life is a life. The words haunted her. He hadn't seen a white girl an enemy, a piece of merchandise. He had simply seen a life in danger and acted. As night fell, Nacho Kai's condition worsened. His breathing grew shallow, and he began to drift in and out of consciousness, muttering deliriously in his own tongue. Geronimo's face, illuminated by the low fire, was a mask of grim concern. Taza paced like a caged wolf, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. Olivia knew she couldn't just sit there. She had to do something. Anything. Her mind raced, sifting through the forgotten memories of her mother, a woman who had possessed a quiet knowledge of plants and remedies. She remembered her mother treating a ranch hand for a fever with tea made from willow bark. Willow, she whispered to herself. She scanned the dark canyon walls. Willows grew near water. There had to be a wash or a spring nearby. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she approached the fire. Taza immediately moved to block her path, his hand on his knife, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Stay back," he warned in broken English. Olivia flinched but held her ground. She looked past him to Geronimo. "Water," she said, her voice raspy. "Trees. By water. White bark. For fever." She tried to mimic the shape of the long, thin leaves with her hands. Geronimo looked up, his old eyes, weary but sharp. He understood. He knew the plant she meant. He looked at Nacho Kai, then back at her. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing her sincerity against the risk. Taza scoffed. "She will run. It is a trick." "He saved my life," Olivia said, her voice stronger now, looking directly at Taza. "I will not run." There was a long, tense silence. Geronimo made the decision. He gave a slight nod and pointed into the darkness down the canyon. It was a dismissal and an instruction all in one. Taza looked betrayed, but he stepped aside his glare, following Olivia as she grabbed a water skin and slipped out of the firelight. The darkness was absolute. Every rustle in the brush sounded like another snake. Every shadow held a new terror. But her fear for Nacho Kai was greater than her fear of the night. She followed the natural slope of the canyon, her senses straining. Finally she heard it, the faint trickle of water. She found a tiny hidden spring feeding a patch of damp earth. And there, ghostly in the moonlight, was a small thicket of desert willow. Her hands trembled as she stripped the bark, stuffing it into her pockets. When she returned to the camp, the scene was unchanged. She handed the bark to Geronimo, who inspected it, crushed a piece to his nose, and then gave her a look of grudging respect. He immediately set about boiling it in a small pot over the fire. She had done it. She had helped. It was a small thing, but it was something. As Geronimo administered the willow bark tea, a new sound reached them. The clatter of shod horses on rock coming from the direction they had traveled. It was not the soft tread of Apache ponies. Taza was instantly alert, melting into the shadows to scout. He returned minutes later, his face grim. "Inda," he hissed. "White men, 3 of them, following their trail." A cold dread washed over Olivia. She knew with a sickening certainty who it was. Adrian Croft. He must have discovered her gone, and furious at the loss of his property, tracked them. Croft was not a man to let a possession go, especially not to Apaches. Their camp was suddenly a trap. They were pinned down with a sick leader in a canyon with only one way out. Geronimo looked at the delirious Nacho Kai, then at the approaching threat. Taza checked his rifle, his expression feral. This was a fight they might not win. In that moment, Olivia made a choice. Croft represented her past, a life of miserable servitude. The Apaches represented an unknown, terrifying future. But one of them had just saved her life at the risk of his own. "The rocks," she said, suddenly her voice urgent. Taza and Geronimo looked at her. She pointed up the steep side of the canyon wall to a place where a pile of loose scree and precariously balanced boulders overlooked the narrow path. Up there. A slide. It was a desperate idea, a long shot, but it was better than waiting to be slaughtered. Taza's eyes widened slightly as he understood her meaning. He glanced at the canyon wall, then at her. A flicker of something surprised consideration passed across his features. He made a decision. He looked at Geronimo and spoke rapidly. The old warrior nodded his gaze, lingering on Olivia for a second, before he turned back to Nacho Kai. "Stay with him," Taza ordered Olivia, shoving his rifle into her hands. The weight of it was shocking. "If they get past me—" "You use this." He didn't wait for a reply. He scrambled up the canyon wall with the agility of a mountain goat, disappearing into the darkness. Olivia was left by the fire with a dying leader, and his ancient companion, a heavy rifle in her hands, and her former master closing in. The world had turned upside down. The man who had despised her had just entrusted her with their leader's life. He had chosen to trust her plan. The hoofbeats grew louder. Olivia's heart pounded in her throat. She could hear Croft's grating voice calling out threats into the night. She looked at Nacho Kai, his face pale and slick with sweat in the firelight. His life and hers now depended on an alliance forged in desperation, a plan conceived by a captive and executed by her captor. The dust of the canyon floor seemed to be mingling with the blood in their veins, binding them together against a common enemy. The night stretched into a wire of pure tension. Olivia knelt beside Nacho Kai, the heavy rifle resting across her knees. Its cold metallic weight was a terrifying responsibility. Geronimo was a statue of concentration, chanting softly as he bathed Nacho Kai's feverish head with a damp cloth. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the sick man's ragged breathing, and the approaching hoofbeats of Adrian Croft and his hired men. Croft's voice echoed in the canyon, a vile stain on the clean night air. "I know you're in here, you heathen devils. You've got something that belongs to me. Send out the girl and I might let you live." Olivia flinched at the word, belongs. It was how he had always seen her. Not as a person, but as an object, like a mule or a sack of beans. A cold fury, purer and hotter than any fear, coursed through her. She tightened her grip on the rifle. From high above there was a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of Taza dislodging a keystone. It was followed by a low rumble that quickly grew into a deafening roar. The rock slide. Shouts of panic and the terrified whinnying of horses rose from the canyon path, then were abruptly cut off by the thunderous crash of tons of rock and earth. Silence. The roar faded, leaving a ringing in Olivia's ears. Dust billowed up from the canyon entrance, a thick, choking cloud in the moonlight. Had it worked? Had they buried them, or just blocked their path? An agonizing weight followed. Every nerve in Olivia's body was screaming. Then a single gunshot cracked the silence. Then another. They hadn't been buried. Croft was still alive. A firefight had begun. Olivia's gaze darted between the canyon entrance and Nacho Kai's still form. Taza was up there alone, against at least 2 men, probably more. She had to do something. She was a terrible shot, having only fired a rifle a handful of times under her father's reluctant tutelage, but she couldn't just kneel here and wait. She looked at Geronimo. The old warrior met her gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod as if reading her mind. He trusted her. Taking a deep breath, Olivia crawled away from the relative safety of the fire, using the deep shadows along the canyon wall for cover. She crept toward the entrance, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The rifle felt clumsy and alien in her hands. She found a position behind a large boulder that gave her a partial view of the path. The rock slide had created a formidable barrier. 2 horses lay dead or dying. A man was pinned beneath one, screaming horribly. And there, taking cover behind the panicked form of his own horse, was Adrian Croft firing his pistol up at Taza's position. "You'll pay for that, you savage!" Croft yelled, his voice cracking with rage and fear. Olivia rested the rifle on the boulder, trying to steady her trembling hands. She lined up the sights on Croft's shadowy form. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Squeeze, Ellie girl, don't jerk it." She fired. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder, a brutal, shocking force. The shot went wild, whining off the canyon wall far to Croft's left, but it had its effect. Croft spun around, his eyes wide with surprise, searching for the source of the second attacker. "What in the hell, Olivia, is that, you girl?" he bellowed. "You siding with them? After what they are, I'll tan your hide for this." His attention was divided. That was all Taza needed. A muzzle flash bloomed from the rocks above. Croft cried out and staggered, clutching his shoulder. His pistol fell from his grasp. He stared at his own blood in disbelief, then looked up at the rocks, then back toward Olivia, his face a mask of shocked betrayal. Before anyone could fire again, Taza let out a piercing war cry and launched himself down the scree slope, moving with impossible speed. He landed on the canyon floor and was on Croft in a heartbeat, the flash of his knife blade swift and final in the moonlight. The canyon fell silent again, the only sounds the pained groaning of the pinned man and the wind. Taza stood over Croft's body, his chest heaving. He looked over at Olivia, who was still huddled behind her rock, the rifle shaking in her hands. He walked over to her, his expression unreadable. He stopped in front of her, looking down at the rifle, then at her face. He reached down and gently took the weapon from her hands. "You fight," he said, his English still broken, but the meaning clear. It wasn't a question or a compliment. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a grudging respect that felt more valuable than any praise. When they returned to the fire, something had shifted. Nacho Kai was conscious. His eyes were open, lucid, though clouded with pain. He had seen. He had heard. He looked at Taza, then his gaze fell on Olivia. He tried to push himself up, and Geronimo gently helped him lean against a rock. "You fought for us." Nacho Kai whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Olivia could only nod, her throat tight with emotion. He held her gaze, and in his dark eyes she saw the walls of distrust and enmity crumble, completely washed away by the blood that had been shed. The roles of captive and captor had dissolved in the heat of battle. They were now just survivors, bound by a shared enemy and a shared fight for life. He reached out his hand, trembling slightly, and brushed his fingers against her cheek, where a streak of gunpowder residue stained her skin. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a fire racing through her veins that had nothing to do with fever or fear. It was a spark of connection, of profound, unspoken understanding. In that moment, kneeling by the fire in a hidden canyon, deep in Apache territory, Olivia Rose realized she was no longer a prisoner. She didn't know what she was: an ally, a comrade, a strange anomaly in their world, but her chains were broken. And the freedom was terrifying, because it came with a new, unexpected bond to the very people she was supposed to despise. The path to Sonora still lay ahead, but her own journey had taken a far more drastic and irreversible turn. She was no longer just fighting to escape. She was fighting for them. The aftermath of the fight left a strange calm in the canyon. Taza dealt with the last of Croft's men, a quick, grim business that Olivia turned away from. There was no celebration, only a weary sense of survival. The immediate threat was gone, but their larger problems remained. Nacho Kai was alive, the fever from the willow bark tea, and his own formidable strength having broken its peak, but he was still weak, the snake venom leaving a toxic residue in his blood. Their mission was more desperate than ever. The dynamic of their small group had been irrevocably altered. Taza no longer looked at Olivia with contempt. He treated her with a wary, quiet respect, often deferring to her with a glance before acting. He had seen her fight, had trusted her plan. In his warrior's code that had earned her a place. Geronimo, too, now included her in his quiet rituals, sharing his meager food with her without hesitation, and showing her which plants were safe to eat. But it was the change in Nachokai that affected her most deeply. As his strength slowly returned over the next few days of careful travel, the silence between them was no longer one of hostility or circumstance, but of a deep, burgeoning intimacy. They spoke little, but their glances were filled with unspoken volumes. He would watch her as she walked, his eyes tracing her movements with a gentle intensity. When she stumbled, his hand would be there to steady her before she fell. One evening, as they made a cold camp under a vast star-dusted sky, he found her sitting alone on a rock, staring out at the immense silent landscape. He sat down beside her, the space between them comfortable, not charged with tension. "My people," he began, his voice still raspy, but stronger now. "They are dying. A sickness of the lungs that steals the breath. The Mexican traders in Sonora have the white man's medicina, the quinine. It is our only hope." He was explaining everything to her, not as a captor to a prisoner, but as one person to another. He was giving her the truth she had only pieced together from whispers. "Why me?" She asked softly the question that had burned in her mind. "Why did you save me from the snake?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the distant mountains silhouetted against the last vestiges of twilight. "When the snake struck," he said, turning to look at her, his eyes dark and serious. "I did not see a white eyes, girl. I did not see a stranger. I saw Devir," she repeated, unfamiliar with the word. "It means spirit, life, the fire within. I saw that in you from the first moment when you lay by the fire, feigning sleep. You have a strong spirit. Taza saw a burden. I saw a survivor. The world has tried to break you, but your spirit will not break. To let such a fire be extinguished by the fangs of a snake, it would have been a great wrong." His words struck her more deeply than any physical touch. He had seen her. Not her gender, not her race, not her status as a captive. He had seen the core of who she was, the resilient, stubborn spark she had guarded so fiercely in the ashes of her life. "You are no longer a captive Olivia Rose." He continued, speaking her full name for the first time. "You are free to go. When we are near the fort at Bowie, I will give you food and water. You can return to your people." The offer hung in the air between them. Freedom. It was everything she had craved, everything she had plotted for. The path back to the white world, to safety. But the word felt hollow now. What was she returning to a world that had left her an orphan, that had allowed a man like Adrian Croft to own her a world, that saw Nachokai and his people as nothing more than savages to be eradicated? She looked at his face, at the lines of exhaustion and responsibility etched there. She looked at his arm, still bandaged the scar from the snakebite, a permanent reminder of his sacrifice. She thought of the sick children and elders waiting for the medicine he was so desperate to secure. Her world was no longer black and white. It was a complex tapestry of pain, loyalty, and a fierce, unexpected love that had taken root in the most barren ground imaginable. To leave him now would feel like abandoning a part of her own soul. "And what of your plan?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "To trade me to the Mexicans." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "That was the plan of a desperate man who did not know you. I cannot trade a part of my own spirit." The admission was breathtaking. It was everything. Olivia took a deep breath, the cool desert air filling her lungs. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. A white woman among the Apache would be an outcast in both worlds, a ghost belonging to neither. But for the first time in her life, she felt she might not be alone. "My place is not at Fort Bowie," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I have no people there. My father, Jedediah, used to say, 'Home isn't a place, it's the people you're willing to fight for.'" She turned and met his intense gaze. "My fight is here now, with you. Let's go to Sonora. Let's get the medicine." A look of profound, heart-stopping relief washed over Nachokai's features. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was no longer just a comfort or a surprise. It was a promise, a beginning. Under the silent watch of 1,000,000 stars, 2 survivors from warring worlds chose a new path. Not as captive and captor, not as Apache and White Eyes, but as 2 spirits, 2 fires who had found in each other a reason to fight, not just for survival, but for a future. A future they would have to carve out for themselves, one scarred but hopeful step at a time. And so Olivia's story transforms from one of captivity to one of purpose. Her journey with Nachokai is far from over, and the path to Sonora is riddled with dangers that will test their newfound alliance and budding love. They are 2 people from worlds that are at war, yet they found a common humanity in the dust and desperation of the Arizona Territory. Theirs is a story that reminds us that our fiercest enemies can sometimes hold the key to our salvation, and that the bravest act of all is to lay down the weapon of hatred and open our hearts to understanding. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of the Wild West. If this story of courage, survival, and unexpected love moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing it with someone who loves a powerful tale. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story exploring the untold corners of the human heart. Until next time, stay brave and keep listening.